Welcome to It's Your Move, a show that may challenge the way you view persons with disabilities. This show is a production of Westchester Independent Living Center. We are a disability rights advocacy and referral organization located right here in White Plains on 10 County Center Road. Autism is probably one of the most highly misunderstood conditions. My guest tonight is David CJ. He's going to define autism, talk about its social and political ramifications, and the myths and misconceptions connected to it. We hope tonight's discussion will provide you with a greater awareness of our growing autism community. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, David, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you involved in autism advocacy.
Right. So, a little bit about myself. I do live in Westchester. I'm in New Rochelle. Been here all my life. When it comes to what I am autistic, I have 2 mental illnesses, but just focusing on being autistic for a minute. For me, that can look like not getting social cues, like being very literal, not really getting the vague jokes my family will mention sometimes. Mm-hmm. I had a little thing today with a quote that's written on a wall in the family home. And what people don't talk about as often as the social cues and the more social side of it can be sensory difficulties, like sensory sensitivities folks have. For me, that means I'm undersensitive to the hot, cold, and to smell, but oversensitive to taste and textures of food, along with bright lights and loud noises. So some quick examples, I'm not going to go into every little sensory thing, but when it comes to the smell, for example, that one can be pretty bad for me. Like I'll cook for myself every now and again, and I'll leave the flame on after I'm done, and even if I'm in the same room, I can't smell that the gas is burning. And then my mom will have to come in from wherever she is and go, "What's that smell?" And I'm like, "Man, not again." And so, just kind of turning that off before anything happens to the house. With the oversensitivities, I just can't really drive right now. It's not really best for me, especially with being directionally challenged. Also kind of an autistic thing, by the way. And with food, I just can't really eat certain, like a lot of vegetables and fibrous things. It doesn't work for me. Happens to a bunch of autistic people. Glad to find other autistic folks out there with that similarity. When it comes to autistic advocacy, I met other autistic people who were advocates and spreading the good word on social media and being involved in whatever protests they were able to work with different organizations, and learning from them and the work that they were doing is how I got involved. Is the easiest way I can put it, just working with other folks who are already doing it.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit later in the show about some of the myths and misconceptions around autism, but I know David. I met David. He's one of our interns at WILC. He's one of our more esteemed interns at WILC. You're working with us on systems advocacy and a bunch of other things. You did an amazing, candidate fact sheet for us, and you graduated from SUNY Purchase last year?
Yeah, last year.
So, I think some of the myths, which we'll talk about later, is the capabilities of autistic people and sort of painting everyone with a broad brush.
Yeah.
So obviously, you just mentioned some of the challenges that you have, but cognitive challenges is not one of them.
So, it can, like I mentioned this earlier, it can be a little hard to figure out what someone's saying or process information sometimes. Sometimes it's just hard to think. And I won't be too sure of how to respond, and I might get really frustrated because I can't find the words I have to say, and I'll just kind of start fidgeting or flailing really hard around my family or to myself, and that can be a little challenging. But that doesn't mean I'm incapable of presenting myself and speaking for myself and doing things like this and some of the other things I've done with my time.
Sure. So some of the myths, we'll talk about that now, I guess, since we're talking about it. Some of the myths around and misconceptions regarding autism. I know there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy about the MMR vaccine causing it, that autism can be a form of childhood schizophrenia. Everyone with autism is the same. So I named 3 of those. But a lot of misconceptions around that. Right.
So the one I'm actually going to start with is just the childhood schizophrenia one. Back when people didn't really understand what autism was or anything really about autistic people, the medical misconception was that autism was childhood schizophrenia because, these people weren't really talking and, they, stim all over the place and, maybe
Stim.
it depends on the person, but there's different kinds of stimming, like fidgeting or like doing
okay.
this, for example.
Right.
So, and when someone's like having a meltdown and no one's really accommodating them, and that's kind of where meltdowns come from, you know, someone might lash out in violence as a last resort, like the only response they have left for someone to hear that they can't tolerate the environment they're in right now.
Right.
So childhood schizophrenia is something like many decades ago. People don't use that term anymore. I would really hope, like I haven't heard of that coming back recently, but
It's amazing. I was telling you before the show, right? I did a little research last night,
Right.
and it's still there. It's out there. It's very prominent, and widely. I think people still talk about it. It's in the
right,
public
that's
discourse.
it's really it's a couple of things, but that's just really upsetting, and
Sure.
how like very blatantly ableist a lot of folks still are,
Right.
especially when you're talking about like doctors and professionals who will still use very outdated misconceptions about what autistic people experience and who autistic people are. Like schizophrenia and autism are two very different
Absolutely.
disabilities, and not to shame one or the other. It's just that it doesn't, like, you have to make sure that you're accurately describing what the people experience. And childhood schizophrenia is from so many decades ago. It's not surprising to see that it's still around,
Yeah.
that people are still carrying around that much stigma with them in their day-to-day lives against autistic folks. The MMR vaccine is something that doesn't surprise me. I know I reacted to that.
Yeah.
With the MMR vaccine,
A lot of
like
controversy.
so many scientists have done studies in multiple countries around the world showing that the MMR vaccine and vaccines in general do not cause autism.
So let
That's
me
not
ask
a
you.
thing.
So why do you think it persists, though? I mean, it just came up during the recent election, correct?
Right. So there are like fake doctors and quack doctors,
Okay,
like
right.
Andrew Wakefield, who spread these myths, and people are like, oh, there's like a conspiracy, and the
gotcha.
government's covering up
I see.
this like forced like disablement of the population, and we have to stop them, and the system's working against us. That's not happening.
Right. Okay.
Even the Centers
So
for
the
Disease
science
Control will say
bears
that
it
like
out.
there's
Right.
even the Centers for Disease Control will agree that like with these folks when they say that like the rates of autism are skyrocketing when they're not.
Right.
So there's no conspiracy. The government agrees with you. You have to stay away from people who don't really have science on their side.
Yeah. And to be
and
informed, like
yeah.
anything else, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned all autistic people are the same, I believe, is one of the misconceptions.
Right. Yes.
Like my first response is just not. I'm not surprised that people honestly still do that. There are a lot of folks who expect all autistic people to do very specific things, like to all be savants, to all never
Right.
get social cues, to all like never really be able to hold down a romantic or sexual relationship.
Absolutely.
And like just super be into math and science and not be into art and not really understand things. And there are some folks who have those experiences, and yes, like there are some folks who like have difficulty with dating and relationships and go to groups for that, and there are folks who like don't understand as many social cues as other folks, and that's part of what they experience. There's something shameful in that. Like that's just part of who they are as an autistic person, and that doesn't deserve the stigma, but it also doesn't deserve folks kind of saying that everyone does the same things. It's just not true.
Right.
Like
So autism. The definition of autism is a certain set of behaviors, right? It's a spectrum condition, in other words.
Right. So that spectrum, though, is I know we'll talk about what the spectrum looks like in a minute, but that autism is usually seen as a developmental disability that can affect the way someone thinks, moves, learns, uses their senses, communicates, and relates to the people around them. That's the definition I can remember off the top of my head. The way disabilities are categorized is a conversation we can have another time.
Sure.
But if you have any follow-up questions based on the myths, the stigma.
Yeah, no, that was I just I guess the spectrum, we could identify that as a maybe you just did, autism as defined as a certain set of behaviors, and that's why we say if someone is on the spectrum. We've all heard that phrase, correct?
Right. A certain set of behaviors. I'm not too sure how I feel about that.
Oh, okay. All right.
It reminds me of a couple of things I know we're going to talk about later. I would go more towards, this is a developmental disability, and this is how it affects people. I'd kind of start to stay away from the behaviorism
All right.
response to autistic folks. Like, I understand there are some autistic folks who might need to be reminded to do certain things. Like my family will have to remind me to like fix a button or to like brush my teeth because I just can't remember to do those things, and that's
Right.
fine. But I'd stay away from behaviorism as much as you can.
Sure. So it's more of a political term that's
Yeah, there's
objectionable.
language has meaning,
Yeah,
whether or not we intend
course.
for it to.
Definitely.
And it's important to understand what that meaning is, how that affects people.
Right. I know you mentioned also, which is interesting to me when we were talking about doing this show, you mentioned the term intersectionality.
Yeah, I did.
And why is it an important component of autistic advocacy?
Right. So, intersectionality is a term coined, I think, in the 80s by Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race scholar, black woman who originally was talking about the intersections that black women face as folks who are black and are women experience misogyny and sexism and also experience racism
Right.
and what that is like. And over time, the theory has evolved into an explanation for different kinds of oppression and discrimination depending on each other to continue to exist. So racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, the list can, there's obviously much more, it gets more descriptive than that. But it's important to autistic advocacy because not all autistic people are white, cisgender, straight, rich, and can walk, you know.
Right.
So that's a lot of what you get in media and the makeup of autism or in autistic organizations and
So it's like a
in
stereotype.
government
It's like a
agencies.
stereotyping.
Is the stereotype that everyone is a part of this very privileged group,
Right.
like looks a lot like me basically.
Right, exactly.
Lives in the kind of neighborhood that I live in, and all these other things. It's not accurate. You're erasing a lot of people. Erasure is violence. It's very violent to say this group of people is not
Absolutely.
capable of existing. It does not
Definitely.
deserve to exist.
Sure. Well, that's the stigma. I mean, and that
You know.
happens, I think, within the realm of disability. I see that with just in my own work as a disability rights advocate.
Yeah.
The generalizations, the stereotyping, the devaluing, you know, the misclassification, all
Yeah.
of it, right? So it's
Yeah.
especially prominent. That's an interesting word that I've
Yeah, and the misclassification, when you're talking about autistic people of color specifically, misclassification is either like you have a behavioral disorder or an intellectual disability when you don't.
Right.
And you're not considered worthy of services. So a friend of mine,
Exactly.
Mallory Cruz, was in a video published by Seriously TV about just breaking down some misconceptions about autistic folks. And one of the things that she said during that conversation is that for autistic kids of color, you're usually assumed that autism cannot be a disability you have. This is inherent of your race. You people just act like that, and so you can't be autistic.
You people, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
so that's the mindset that autistic folks of color experience all too often. Like their IEPs aren't followed,
Right.
people aren't accommodated, you don't get services to begin with, and the quality of your life doesn't look too good, and people don't believe you can even be autistic, so the services won't really be tailored to the needs you'll have
Yeah.
as someone who's autistic and a person of color. They won't really be culturally competent, and that can and does impact the services people do
Absolutely.
end up receiving. And intersectionality
Absolutely.
becomes so important there because you're incorporating the culture these folks have and the different
Right.
identities they have into the work you're doing, and you're making sure people do have the services they need, that respects their cultures and doesn't kind of step over them and say you have to
Right.
do what we're doing, not what your family has been doing. And
We're going to have you back on another show. We're going to really have a real robust discussion about
Yeah.
that, some of the advocacy and a lot of the resources available.
Yeah.
I want to talk about something. Now we got about 10 minutes or so left. Everyone knows who Christopher Reeve is, and
Yeah.
he sort of championed the Cure Not Care movement, and which sort of seemed a noble objective for most individuals outside the disability community. You know, if there's a cure, that's great. But the message that we got was, unless we're cured, unless we're able-bodied, we're not as valued. There's something wrong with us. And it sort of, reinforced the negative societal views that people with disabilities, again, need to be cured in order to live fulfilling lives. A similar controversy exists in the autistic community regarding services and accommodation. You touched on it just a moment ago, but can you just talk a bit more about it in that context with the Cure Not Care movement?
Right. So what I'm calling the cure debate is very popular on social media in different organizations. There's like the Autism Community, which is like everyone who's not autistic, and then autistic people
Yeah.
over here, and then autistic people who will get into these debates about whether or not autistic people are worthy of existing,
Right.
and it's really creepy.
Exactly. It is creepy.
It's eugenics. Like, there's a long history of eugenics that
Yeah.
definitely goes back. That does go back to the Nazis and the Action T4 program that they did on disabled folks, and with the Cure or Not Care movement, it's right now in relation to autistic people, just like, hey, we're a unique group of people. We have a history. We have a culture. We have a rights movement. We matter. We want to live. Stop trying to cure us. We don't need this. We need adequate care and support and accessibility in the communities that we live in. And people will be like, no, you're not like my child. You don't understand what my family has to deal with every day. And lots of things like that. A lot of parents assuming, and other family members assuming our experiences, assuming what struggles that we live with on a day-to-day basis. A lot of these people don't know us and don't know what we experience on a day-to-day basis, don't know how hard it can be for us and how we experience being autistic on a day-to-day basis, don't know what executive functioning we deal with and different sensory things, social cues that we deal with.
Do you feel that's getting better? I mean, do you feel there is, I mean, I can just see, I know that I became disabled later onset in life about 30 years ago.
Right.
And I can see just in that period of time, changes that have been made, a lot more attitudinal shifts in the way I'm treated.
Right.
Some of the misconceptions are not as profound as they were initially.
Right.
It's certainly nowhere near where I'd like it to be.
Right.
But in terms of your autistic community, have you seen, a progressive shift in more of a greater understanding?
Compared to even a decade ago,
Yeah.
there are a lot more autistic-led spaces, conferences, organizations,
Right.
and in that way, it's definitely getting better slowly. There's still improvement that can be made in how the organizations conduct themselves, what kinds of work they're doing for the community, and who they give screen time to.
Sure.
But there are spaces that are made for autistic people and organizations doing really cool things. I encourage the folks watching this to look into the Autism Women's Network and organizations like them who are doing really cool things for autistic women and girls and folks in general.
It's like some things, if you can just give me a couple examples.
One more time?
Autistic women's
So what they do?
Yes.
So some of what they do, they have writers who will write different think pieces that are very moving about what the autistic community experiences at different parts, in different identities. So autistic women of color, for example, different folks will write articles, either responding to big media things or just in general. They've worked on publications. They have one book out right now on what autistic girls and what they wish their parents knew growing up. And one anthology that's coming out soon called All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, an anthology written by, about, and for autistic people of color. Other than that, the Autistic Women's Network actually has a survey that you can self-report for accessible gynecologists for autistic women anywhere in the country. And that can be a really cool database to have, knowing where you can go for that kind of healthcare.
Right. So, this is what we do, right, as advocates. I mean, we in my work, I generate and respond to action alerts, and these are basically, strategies to raise awareness regarding issues of impact to our community.
Right.
And, we engage in letter writing campaigns, calling legislators, email blasts, Twitter posts, that kind of thing. And I know that the Disability Day of Mourning is one such action, which is pretty phenomenal. It takes place annually to raise awareness about disability-related filicide,
Right.
which is pretty horrific. So tell us a little bit about that. What's going on?
Right. So
with that movement,
right.
the Day of Mourning, and what that term means.
Right. What filicide means. Right.
Disability filicide.
Right. So filicide in general refers to someone murdering their kids. When the disabled community is talking, the term filicide becomes a disabled person who was murdered by their family members or their caregivers, sometimes both. The Disability Day of Mourning came about around 2012.
Recent.
To respond to all of the violence from family members and caregivers to disabled folks. So many people we've lost over the last 3 decades. The Disability Day of Mourning happens every March 1st in communities across the country. And there are different organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network that's behind getting people set up as visual coordinators and setting these up across the country in different areas. And one of the main pieces of this vigil is to read off the list of names of the people who were killed and at times, depending on how the vigil is set up, how they were killed. And there's about, I think it was 737 people on the list this year.
For
So
1 year?
Over 3 decades.
Over 3 decades.
So of all
Okay.
the time from then to now, 737 disabled
Right.
people were murdered by our family members and caregivers, and usually we're the only ones talking about it.
So,
And that can get very-
this is a whole show in and of itself, right? So there's compassion, homicide. I did a couple of stories about that. Family members murdering their children because they felt they were better off dead. Okay, so you're talking about this
Right.
mainly with family members murdering
Right.
their children, their other family
their
members.
loved ones, their spouses. I was looking over the list with a close friend who is the co-president of Disabled Students Union at Purchase College, a disabled students group I started when I was there, and it got really horrifying.
Yeah.
The methods, like there are a couple of folks who hired hitmen to murder their disabled loved
Seriously?
ones. Hitmen. They paid someone professionally
Oh my.
to just take someone out.
That's incredible.
That's horrifying, and that's the kind of violence that the disabled community deals with.
And so, what's the legal? So, what are these folks being brought to justice? Is there enough advocacy around this? Is there enough awareness around this?
Right, so there can definitely be a lot better media coverage. The media coverage usually just like glorifies these murderers, and so does the comment section.
Sensationalize them.
And the judicial system usually doesn't give the judicial system will usually give a lower sentence to someone who murdered a disabled person than someone
True.
who murdered a non-disabled person.
Right.
And
Well, there's a case in Canada. It was sorry to interrupt, but it just comes to mind quickly, of a man who killed his daughter. She
gassed her to
had
death and just watched her die. Yeah.
she had CP. She
Yeah.
was 11, and he just felt that his wife had passed on, I believe, and he couldn't. He thought she was struggling. She didn't have a quality of life, and he smothered her. And the courts in Canada called it compassionate homicide. It was the first time that I believe that term was used, and he was exonerated. And then it came back to a different court, but it was in the public, it was debated for several years before there was some actual public outcry that this was wrong.
Right.
And we have right now the aid in dying bill that probably won't pass in New York State, but it's the physician-assisted suicide, which poses a great threat to our community, as you know, and that's another whole show. But again, folks with disabilities are viewed as suffering. They don't have fulfilled lives and probably better off dead. So that's a huge issue. We have about 4 minutes left, David. I want to get to something else that's very important. We talk about non-speaking. The word non-speaking comes into discussions of folks with autism and institutionalization, and why there's a misconception that folks with complex medical needs and folks who are non-speaking are probably better off institutionalized. You speak a bit about that.
Right. So there's this word paternalism
Right.
that relates back to restricting the rights and freedoms that somebody has for their own good.
Right.
And that it reeks of that when you're talking about institutionalizing someone for their own good. They can't function on their own. There's no way they'd be able to survive on their own, be an advocate and educate folks. There are plenty of non-speaking autistic folks like Carly Fleischman, who's rather popular, Amy Sequenzia, Ida Kadar, Timothy John, so many folks in different countries who are.
And what are they involved in?
Right, so there's artistic advocacy that they do.
Yep.
Some people write, some people do speaking engagements.
Right.
A couple of folks do both. You'll see people at different conferences, and who'll be really important there. And I encourage anyone watching to just look up a video by Amethyst Shaver, How to Be an Ally, and there's a list of non-speaking folks that they've highlighted, and links to the work that they do so that you can check them out.
Can you spell it for us?
So Amethyst. So AMETHYSTCSCHABER.
Okay.
If that doesn't work, just try typing Ask an Autistic into YouTube.
Oh, okay. All right.
And you'll be able to find their channel and their videos. And if you just type How to Be an Ally after Ask an Autistic, you should see the video I'm referring to, and just spells out for you how to support the autistic people in your life and in the community that you're in, and just in general, and resources on educating yourself on the non-speaking folks that are always more than capable of speaking for themselves and representing themselves. Every person is, and that doesn't go away when you suddenly take away someone's ability to speak.
Absolutely. And what would you, do you have any statistics on the amount of folks that are institutionalized currently, or that have been
Right.
over, say, the last several years?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I know that with decisions like the Olmsted decision
Right.
from 1999, making a mandate for disabled folks to live in the communities they live in with community-based
Right.
support and not in institutions,
Absolutely.
that's getting better.
Yes.
And there are less people in institutions now, and that's always a plus.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that, there's always more work to be done, always more folks that don't need to be in those nursing homes and in the residential institutions and in
Right.
the group homes and the hospitals, and who can and deserve the right to just be in their own communities and already
Civil
have
right.
it. Yeah.
It's a civil right. Yeah, the Olmsted decision, which was a Supreme Court decision in 1999, that upheld that folks should live in the most integrated setting possible, which is the majority of work we do at the center as well, trying to transition folks out of nursing homes
Right.
back into the community with community-based supports. Folks do a lot better rather than being locked into institutions, obviously, and denied
Excuse me.
their rights. Dave, if someone wants to get in touch with you, David, how would they reach you? If
I
they
can-
wanted more
right.
resources, or if they wanted to, to get in touch with more resources or have a discussion.
Right. If you have any questions or concerns about different services that are available or anything I've said, just reach me at David, DAVID, CJ, mentoring, MENTORING, @gmail.com, and I'll answer you as soon as I can.
Excellent. Well, David, thanks for coming on. We're going to have you back, and we're going to talk
Right.
about advocacy and a lot of other things,
I'm looking
too.
forward to it. Thank you for
Absolutely.
having
Thank you
me.
so much, David. And thank you for tuning in. We welcome your comments and suggestions. You can always reach us. There'll be some phone numbers at the end of the show, and we encourage you to give us your feedback. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.